Picture this. It's 1942, and you're standing on the deck of a beat-up fishing boat off the coast of Maine. You've got no military training, no weapons worth mentioning, and you're wearing the same clothes you wore yesterday when you were hauling lobster traps. But right now, at this exact moment, you're hunting one of Nazi Germany's most lethal weapons, a U-boat prowling just beneath the surface, looking for American ships to sink. This isn't fiction. This isn't some Hollywood fantasy. For months during World War II, ordinary fishermen, yacht club members, and weekend sailors became America's first line of defense against an enemy that was winning. And the crazy part? The U.S. Navy didn't even want their help at first. They called them the Hooligan Navy, a dismissive nickname that was supposed to be an insult. But these civilians ended up doing something the most powerful navy in the world couldn't figure out how to do fast enough. And the story of how it happened reveals something most history books completely skip over. Because here's what they don't tell you about World War II. America was losing. Badly. Not in Europe, not in the Pacific. Right here, along our own coastline. German U-boats were sinking American ships within sight of beach resorts. People in Miami and Atlantic City could literally watch tankers explode on the horizon while they ate dinner. And for the first 6 months of 1942, the United States had essentially no defense against it. The numbers were terrifying. In January 1942 alone, German submarines sank 62 ships in American waters. By the end of June, that number had climbed to over 400 vessels destroyed. That's more than 2 ships every single day going to the bottom, taking fuel, food, weapons, and often their entire crews with them. The Germans called it the second happy time. Their submarines were having so much success that U-boat commanders treated the American coast like a shooting gallery. And the U.S. Navy, they were almost completely unprepared for this kind of warfare. See, before the war, the Navy had focused on building big battleships and aircraft carriers, the kind of impressive warships that looked good in newsreels and won major sea battles. But hunting submarines? That required small, fast patrol boats and specialized anti-submarine equipment. Things America simply didn't have enough of when the war started. The Navy tried everything they could with what they had. They organized convoys. They deployed the few submarine chasers they possessed. They even asked the Coast Guard to help. But there was a massive problem nobody wanted to admit. The Atlantic coastline is enormous. Thousands of miles of vulnerable shipping lanes, countless harbors, rivers, inlets, and channels where U-boats could hide, refuel, or lie in wait. The Navy had maybe a few dozen suitable vessels to patrol all of it. It was like trying to guard an entire city with 5 security guards. That's when a yacht designer from Massachusetts had an idea that sounded absolutely insane. His name was Alfred Stanford, and he'd spent years sailing the New England coast, racing yachts and mingling with the kind of wealthy sailing enthusiasts who belonged to yacht clubs and owned their own boats. And Stanford realized something the Navy brass hadn't considered. There were thousands of private boats sitting in harbors up and down the coast. Fishing vessels, pleasure yachts, sailboats, owned by people who knew these waters better than any naval officer ever could. But here's where it gets interesting. When Stanford first proposed creating a civilian coastal patrol force, the Navy laughed at him. Actually, laughed. The idea of weekend sailors and fishermen helping the United States Navy seemed preposterous. One admiral supposedly said it would be like asking Boy Scouts to guard Fort Knox. These weren't military men. They hadn't been to boot camp. They didn't follow naval protocol. Hell, most of them probably couldn't even salute properly. Stanford didn't give up. He knew something the admirals didn't want to acknowledge. Desperation changes everything, and by early 1942, America was desperate. So Stanford kept pushing, kept making calls, kept showing up at Navy offices with his proposal, and finally, someone listened. Not because they thought it was a great idea, but because they were running out of options. In April 1942, the Coast Guard Auxiliary was officially established, and Stanford's volunteer force became reality. Within weeks, thousands of civilian boat owners volunteered. Not for glory, there wasn't any. Not for pay, because there wasn't much of that either. They volunteered because German submarines were killing American sailors within sight of their homes, and the government had finally admitted it needed help. The boats they used were nothing like military vessels. We're talking about fishing trawlers that smelled like yesterday's catch, pleasure yachts built for champagne parties, sailboats that had never ventured beyond weekend harbor cruises. Some were barely seaworthy. Many had engines that broke down constantly. Almost none had any kind of weapon system. The Hooligan Navy nickname. It fit. These weren't warships. They were floating junkyards with volunteer crews. But Stanford understood something crucial. These civilians had advantages the Navy didn't. They knew every inlet, every sandbar, every hiding spot along their local coastline. They could identify which boats belonged in an area and which didn't. They knew the normal rhythms of coastal life, what fishing boats should be doing at what times, which shipping routes were busiest, where the currents flowed strongest. This wasn't book learning. This was knowledge earned through years of actually working and sailing these waters. The Navy gave them minimal training, basically a weekend crash course in maritime patrol procedures and how to recognize enemy vessels. They issued them some basic equipment, binoculars, charts, radio sets when available, and small arms that would be essentially useless against a submarine but made everyone feel slightly better. Some boats got depth charges later on, though dropping a depth charge from a sailboat is about as dangerous for the boat as it is for the submarine. And then they sent them out to hunt U-boats. Let that sink in for a second. The United States government was asking civilians in private boats, many of them wooden boats that would splinter like toothpicks if hit by torpedo, to patrol waters where German submarines were actively hunting. The volunteers knew the risks. They'd seen the burning tankers. They'd heard the explosions. Some had personally watched ships go down. And they went anyway. The first patrols were chaotic. Nobody really knew what they were doing. Some volunteers treated it like a harbor cruise until they spotted actual debris from a sunken ship or heard a distress call over the radio. Others took it deadly seriously from day one, maintaining strict watch schedules and reporting every suspicious ripple in the water. The Hooligan Navy had no unified training, no standard procedures, no real command structure. It was barely organized chaos held together by patriotism and stubbornness. But something unexpected started happening. The presence of these civilian patrols began changing the math for German U-boat commanders. See, submarine warfare depends heavily on surprise and isolation. A U-boat wants to surface at night to recharge batteries, or periscope depth during the day to scout for targets without being spotted. Before the civilian patrols, the American coast was essentially wide open. U-boats could operate with impunity, taking their time to line up perfect shots on ships that weren't even taking defensive measures. Now, suddenly, there were boats everywhere. Small boats, unpredictable boats, boats that appeared in places U-boat commanders didn't expect. Were they military? Were they civilian? Did they have weapons? Radio communication? A U-boat captain seeing an unknown vessel couldn't take the risk. They had to assume every boat might report their position, might call in aircraft or proper military vessels, might even attack with depth charges. The psychological impact was enormous. German U-boat war diaries from this period show increasing frustration with American coastal patrols. Commanders reported having to abort attacks because patrol boats appeared unexpectedly. They had to stay submerged longer, which limited their battery life and operational range. They couldn't surface to recharge as freely. The entire American coastline had transformed from a turkey shoot into contested waters. But the civilian sailors were doing more than just making U-boats nervous. They were rescuing survivors from torpedoed ships, often under conditions that would terrify most people. Imagine responding to a distress call and arriving at a scene of absolute chaos, a tanker on fire, Oil spreading across the water, men screaming for help in the darkness, and knowing that the submarine that caused this destruction might still be nearby. Might be watching through its periscope. Might decide your boat looks like a good target too. These volunteers pulled hundreds of sailors from the water. They navigated through burning oil slicks to reach survivors. They gave up their own clothes, their food, their bunks to men suffering from hypothermia and burns. Some made multiple rescue runs in a single night. And they did all of this knowing they had essentially no protection if the U-boat decided to attack them. There's a story about a fishing boat called the Nirvana operating off the coast of North Carolina. In May 1942, the crew spotted a life raft with survivors from a torpedoed freighter. As they pulled alongside to help, they saw a periscope less than 200 yards away, just watching them. The U-boat was still there, observing. The Nirvana's captain had a choice: abandon the survivors and run, or complete the rescue and hope the U-boat commander had enough humanity not to attack a fishing boat conducting a rescue operation. They chose to save the survivors. The submarine watched but didn't fire. Not every crew was that lucky. The Navy started realizing these civilian volunteers were providing something else invaluable: intelligence. The hooligan Navy boats were covering waters the military simply couldn't patrol regularly. They were spotting unusual activity, identifying suspicious vessels, reporting debris fields and oil slicks that indicated recent attacks. They became the eyes and ears of the American coastal defense system, filling gaps that would have otherwise been completely blind. By mid-1942, the U-boat situation along the American coast was finally starting to improve. Not just because of the hooligan Navy. The military was also deploying more submarine chasers, organizing better convoy systems, and implementing the coastal blackout that finally stopped silhouetting ships against brightly lit beach resorts. But the civilian patrol force played a role that's been largely forgotten in popular history. Over 50,000 civilian volunteers eventually served in the Coast Guard Auxiliary during World War II. They operated more than 15,000 private vessels. They logged millions of patrol hours in all weather conditions, all seasons, all times of day and night. And they did it for basically no recognition. While soldiers fighting overseas got parades and medals and newspaper headlines, the hooligan Navy just kept sailing, kept watching, kept protecting American waters with whatever boats they could provide. The casualties weren't insignificant either. Several civilian patrol boats were attacked by U-boats. Some were sunk. Volunteers died, not in dramatic naval battles that would be remembered in history books, but in quiet patrols that went wrong, in bad weather, in accidents, in encounters with an enemy that didn't distinguish between military and civilian targets. Their names aren't on most war memorials. Their stories aren't in most history books, but they were there, and they paid the price. What's fascinating is how this entire operation challenged assumptions about what civilians could do in wartime. The military establishment had initially dismissed the idea as ridiculous, but the hooligan Navy proved that sometimes local knowledge, determination, and sheer numbers matter more than professional training and expensive equipment. These weren't elite warriors. They were boat owners who decided their country needed help and figured out how to provide it with whatever they had available. The German Navy eventually acknowledged the effectiveness of the American coastal patrol system, though they never specifically credited the civilian component. U-boat operations along the American coast became increasingly dangerous throughout 1942 and 1943. Submarines that had once hunted freely were now being hunted themselves. The second happy time ended, replaced by a brutal war of attrition that Germany was losing. American ships started making it across the Atlantic. The supply lines stayed open. And while many factors contributed to this shift, those thousands of civilian boats playing cat and mouse with submarines along the coast played their part. By 1943, as the military built enough proper patrol craft and submarine chasers, the need for civilian coastal patrols diminished. The hooligan Navy gradually transitioned to other duties: harbor security, transportation, search and rescue operations that didn't involve active combat zones. Some volunteers stayed with the Coast Guard Auxiliary throughout the war. Others returned to their normal lives, their brief stint hunting U-boats becoming a story they'd tell at dinner parties that nobody quite believed. After the war, most of these volunteers just went back to fishing, or sailing for pleasure, or whatever they'd been doing before. No parades, no monuments. The term hooligan navy faded from use. The official records acknowledge the Coast Guard Auxiliary existed, but the full story of what these civilians actually did, the risks they took, the lives they saved, the impact they had on the Battle of the Atlantic, got buried in the larger narrative of World War II. And that's the part that's worth remembering. Because the hooligan navy represents something we don't see much anymore. Ordinary people with ordinary skills stepping up when their country faced an emergency, using whatever resources they had available, taking ridiculous risks without expecting recognition or reward. They weren't super soldiers. They weren't special forces. They were fishermen and yacht club members and weekend sailors who decided that sitting at home while German submarines sank American ships wasn't acceptable. There's something powerful in that. In an era where we're used to thinking of war as something conducted by professional militaries with advanced technology and billion-dollar weapon systems, the hooligan navy reminds us that sometimes the most effective defense comes from regular people who know their communities, understand their environment, and are willing to do something when others say it can't be done. The next time you see a fishing boat or a sailboat in a harbor somewhere along the American coast, think about this. There's a chance that boat, or one like it, spent World War II hunting submarines with nothing but binoculars and determination. That the person at the wheel might have been someone's grandfather or great-grandfather who volunteered to patrol dangerous waters in a vessel that had no business being anywhere near a war zone. The hooligan navy wasn't glamorous, it wasn't celebrated. It wasn't even particularly well organized. But when America's coastline was under attack and the military didn't have enough resources to defend it, these civilians showed up with whatever boats they owned and said, "We'll help." And somehow, impossibly, it worked. That's not just a forgotten piece of history. That's a reminder of what's possible when people decide that doing something, anything, is better than doing nothing at all.